Do so very, very quickly. We need to crack on with the next debate. We now come to the backbench debate on the obligation to assess the risk of genocide under international law in relation to the occupied Palestinian territories. I call Brendan O'Hara, who will speak for up to 15 minutes. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I put on record my thanks to the Speaker's office for working so hard to ensure that we had time for this debate this afternoon. And given the pressure of time, I'll say to honourable members that I will not be taking interventions to allow as many backbench contributions as possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to move that this House has considered the obligation to assess the risk of genocide under international law in relation to the occupied Palestinian territories. In his book, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, the Egyptian-Canadian novelist and journalist Omar El-Akkad wrote, "The moral component of history, the most necessary component, is simply a single question asked over and over again. When it mattered, who sided with justice and who sided with power? What makes moments such as this one so dangerous, so clarifying, is that one way or another, everyone is forced to answer. And that is a question which will have to be answered. Perhaps not today, nor even this year, but at some point, all of us, particularly those who hold positions of power and those who have a public platform, will have to answer that fundamental question. Which side were we on? Were we on the side of justice, or did we side with the powerful? And each of us will have to answer when asked, did we speak up for the tens of thousands of Palestinian women and children who were killed? Did we use our platform to actively oppose the forced displacement of millions of Palestinians from their homes and their communities as they were reduced to rubble? And did we condemn unequivocally the collective punishment imposed on an entire population in which the basics necessary to sustain life, water, electricity, food and medicine, had been deliberately withheld from them? Or did we, either by what we said or did, or by what we didn't say or didn't do, side with the powerful? Did we look away because it was in our political or financial interests so to do? And did we give political cover and legitimacy to the Netanyahu regime as it carried out its genocide while our government supplied them with the weapons and military intelligence to do so? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Hamas attack of October the 7th was utterly appalling, and no right-thinking person could excuse or condone what happened that day. Neither, however, could any right-thinking person excuse or condone the Israeli response, which wasn't just disproportionate, it was brutal and it has been relentless. And it's been carried out in such a systematic manner that, in my opinion, no reasonable person could deny that what we have witnessed in Gaza in the past 2.5 years constitutes a genocide. The government has and continues to this day to deny that it is a genocide, and that is a decision which the government will have to explain and with which they will have to live. But today I'm not here to play ping-pong with the government on the legal definition of what does and what doesn't constitute a genocide. Instead, I want to focus on the mountain of evidence that says there is at least a serious risk of genocide occurring. And that serious risk should have triggered the UK's legal obligation to act under the terms of the Genocide Convention, as explained by the International Court of Justice in its Bosnia ruling of 2007. And that obligation comes into effect long before any determination of genocide has been made by a court. The standard of serious risk is designed to be an early warning, one which ensures that states and international bodies act to prevent a genocide from occurring. Clearly, And undeniably, in the case of the Palestinian people of Gaza, the UK has abjectly failed to meet its legal responsibility when alerted to there being a serious risk of genocide. Madam Deputy Speaker, when the UK signed the Genocide Convention in 1948, it promised to prevent and punish this most heinous of crimes. Now, with more than 71,000 people dead, 200,000 people injured, Gaza reduced to an uninhabitable wasteland, with the population in the grip of a man-made famine, with Gaza's medical infrastructure obliterated, and with hundreds of journalists murdered, with water and electricity being used as a means of coercion and punishment, with food and medicine being denied to the starving and the dying, and with repeated forced displacement of millions of civilians, it is surely beyond any dispute that the minimum requirement for the UK to act to prevent and punish the crime of genocide has been met. But arguably, the most damning indictment is that more than 21,000 children, 21,000 children have been killed by the IDF since October 2023. And let's not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in November of 2023, the UK government formally intervened in the case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar at the ICJ, arguing for changes to the definition of genocide, which included lowering the threshold when damage was inflicted on children. Minister, if it is appropriate for the UK to intervene to protect children from the bombs and bullets of the Myanmar military, why is it not appropriate to intervene to protect Palestinian children from the bombs and the bullets of the IDF? Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, genocide is not, and it never has been, about numbers. The numbers killed, while shocking, do not in and of themselves necessarily prove genocide. There are other methods, including deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And that's why it is important that we look at what else has happened in Gaza since October 2023. In the past 2.5 years, Israel has obliterated the agricultural sector. The fishing industry has gone. The road network has been wrecked. Agricultural wells have been demolished. Most croplands and greenhouses have been rendered unusable. The vast majority of livestock have been killed, and the vitally important and culturally significant olive tree crops have been targeted and destroyed. Indeed, such is the devastation that a journalist from The Guardian on board a Jordanian Air Force plane wrote, "Seen from the air, Gaza looks like the ruins of an ancient civilization." And he added that Gaza was raised by an Israeli military campaign that has left behind a place that looks like the aftermath of an apocalypse. That does not happen by accident. And it is impossible to view that this is anything other than a premeditated attempt to erase Palestinians from their land by making it impossible for human life to survive. So by any measure, collectively, all of that constitutes unimpeachable evidence that there has been a serious risk of genocide. And that should have, but hasn't, triggered a response from the UK government to prevent that becoming a full-blown genocide. But it's not as if the government can say that it doesn't know or it was unaware, because time and time again the government, in its own statements from that dispatch box, including from the former Foreign Secretary and the current Prime Minister, have conceded that they know exactly what's happening. But they have chosen to do nothing about it. They've accepted, and have publicly condemned the siege tactics, the denial of humanitarian assistance, the use of starvation as a weapon of war, the use of evacuation orders, the denial of water, food and electricity, the targeting of journalists, healthcare being destroyed, the astronomical numbers of civilian casualties and the deliberate dehumanising of the Palestinian people. So the government, in their own words, have denied undeniable proof that war crimes are being carried out, that mass atrocities are being carried out, and that civilians are being denied the basics to maintain life. And a quick trawl of Hansard will reveal that as far back as January 2024, the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham, saying, and I quote, 85% of the population are displaced and millions face the risk of famine. 2 months later, he said, famine in Gaza is imminent, but what distinguishes the horror in Gaza from what's come before is that it's not driven by drought or natural disaster, it is man-made. And in May of 24, he said, aid is reportedly being blocked and northern Gaza is now in full-blown famine. A year later, in May of 25, he openly acknowledged Israeli war crimes against the civilian population when he said the whole House should be able to utterly condemn the Israeli government's denial of food to hungry children. It is wrong, it is appalling. And then he continued, what we are seeing is inhumane, it is deadly, and it is depriving Gazans of their human dignity. It's there in black and white. The government have acknowledged it, and the Prime Minister, when he was leader of the opposition in October of 23, acknowledged that serious risk, saying civilians must not be targeted. Where Palestinians are forced to flee, they must not be permanently displaced. International law is clear. It means that basic services, including water, electricity and the fuel needed for it, cannot be denied. And as Prime Minister, he said, we continue to see mounting evidence of appalling atrocities against civilians and unacceptable restrictions on humanitarian access. And there are so many more examples of the Prime Minister, the former Foreign Secretary and other ministers from that dispatch box admitting that Israel was using food as a weapon of war, it had manufactured a famine, was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, was committing war crimes and was stripping Gazans of their human dignity. Yet it remains the official position of the UK government that none of that meets the threshold for there being a serious risk of genocide. So, Minister, are we being asked to believe that not even when Defence Minister Yoav Gallant said, I have ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly? Did that not trigger within the government that perhaps there was a serious risk of a genocide occurring? Or when Finance Minister Smotrich said, Gaza will be entirely destroyed, civilians will be sent to the south and from there they will start to leave in great numbers to third countries, did that not trigger that perhaps there was a genocide occurring or a potential risk of a genocide occurring? Or when the President himself, Isaac Herzog, said it is an entire nation out there that is responsible, did that not suggest inside the UK government that perhaps Israel's response to the atrocities of October the 7th was going to be disproportionate, brutal and illegal, and that perhaps continuing selling weapons and maintaining a business-as-usual relationship with Tel Aviv was going to put us in grave danger of breaching our obligations under the Genocide Convention? So it appears, Madam Deputy Speaker, that despite Israel making its intentions unambiguously clear from the very start that they were going to ethnically cleanse Gaza, they would do so using whatever means necessary, and they would do so indiscriminately. It seems that UK government made the political choice to deliberately ignore its obligations so it could continue a business-as-usual relationship with Netanyahu's government. So I will finish where I began, Madam Deputy Speaker, with that powerful quote from Omar el-Akkad. When it mattered, who sided with justice and who sided with power? What makes moments like this so dangerous, so clarifying, is that one way everyone will be forced to answer. This UK government and the government which preceded it have chosen to side with power over justice, and history will judge them accordingly.
The question is as on the order paper, and because I'm going to get everybody in before we finish at 5 o'clock, everyone is on a 3-minute speaking limit. And I first come to Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for bringing this most important debate. This is a debate on an obligation to assess the risk of genocide. So who can disagree with this? There has been a terrible war in Gaza, and although there is a ceasefire, loss of life continues. Now, this was sparked by the October the 7th attack in 2023 and the taking of the hostages, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. This was not a war of Israel's seeking. The aims of the war were to secure the release of the hostages and to prevent Hamas from ever repeating its attack, as it had promised on many occasions. As the chief rabbi says, if Hamas were to lay down its arms, there would be no more fighting. But if Israel were to lay down its arms, there would be no more Israel. Now, genocide is a legal description of the intentional, systematic destruction, in whole or in part, of a national, ethnic, racial or religious group defined by the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, a concept defined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish lawyer from Lviv, Lwów, Lemberg, much in the news, in the aftermath of the war. Now, I first heard of Lemkin in the marvellous book East-West Street by Philippe Sands, who will deliver tonight the Alf Dubs lecture at Battersea. Indeed. Now, intent is the crucial word here. Britain and its allies are not accused of genocide for the strategic bombing of Germany, despite hundreds of thousands of those who were killed. It is a matter for a court to decide on genocide, and despite the many debates about this in this chamber, we can all agree that this is not a court. Now, we know there has been massive loss of life and destruction in Gaza, but for myself, I simply cannot believe it was the stated intention of the government of Israel to completely destroy the population of Gaza. We do not have any means of independently verifying anything, since we're left to rely on news from the Hamas-led health department and the Israel government spokespeople. I directly asked Mr. Herzog, the president of Israel, twice about allowing independent journalists such as CNN or BBC, and I was twice informed that it was too dangerous. Is that still the case? I doubt it. Now there is a ceasefire. So genocide has been used as a rally to protest all over the world, but we have seen where some of this has led. But if we allow this most significant of words to be bandied about with such certainty, do we not risk undermining the words that are needed to describe the Holocaust, which was the intentional and systematic murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazis, the Rohingya expelled en masse, raped and slaughtered, the Uyghurs subject to mass internment, forced sterilisation and cultural erasure, or the mass murders in Rwanda? Genocide is a quite specific crime, and frankly it is not my belief that this was the intent of the Israel Defence Force, but I do agree that there is an obligation for this to be assessed.
Graham Leadbitter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are witnessing in Gaza a catastrophe that is not only foreseeable but preventable. For over 2 years, the UK Government has hidden behind legal sleight of hand while a genocide unfolded in Gaza. The definition of genocide set out in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention is precise. It involves specific acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. Firstly, Madam Deputy Speaker, Article 2A prohibits killing members of such a group. As of January this year, 71,500 Palestinians have been killed, including 570 aid workers and 1,700 health workers. This is not collateral damage. It is the destruction of a people, and it is sickening. Just yesterday, during the current supposed ceasefire, the BBC reported that at least 20 Palestinians, including several children and a paramedic, had been killed and almost 40 others wounded in Israeli strikes in Gaza, according to hospitals in Palestine. The response from the Israeli Defence Force stated that they had carried out precise strikes, so precise apparently that they had to further state the IDF is aware of the claim that several uninvolved civilians, including a medical staff member, were hit in the strike. This is a familiar trope they have used throughout this conflict. If these were the reactions of our own military, the standards we would apply in investigation and response would be rigorous and likely lead to court-martial, because it is not even close to our rightly highly robust rules of engagement rooted in moral integrity. Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, Article 2B prohibits causing serious bodily harm or mental harm. We know that over 143,000 people have been injured, with many maimed for life, and the population has been subjected to torture and arbitrary detention. Thirdly, and perhaps most damningly, Article 2C prohibits deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Amnesty International has found that Israel has systematically destroyed life-sustaining infrastructure, including water, sanitation and energy grids, By creating a so-called buffer zone, Israel has raised 59% of agricultural land in that area, and as of last month, 81% of all structures in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, all the while severely restricting vital aid and supplies. This is the deliberate erasure of the means of survival which has led to widely reported and verifiable famine. When Israeli leaders describe Palestinians as human animals and speak of flattening Gaza and then proceed to destroy 19 hospitals and block essential aid, the intent to destroy the group, as per the definition, is the only reasonable conclusion. Even now, despite the UN Commission of Inquiry finding in September 2025 that Israel has committed genocide, and Amnesty International confirming that genocide continues despite the October ceasefire, the UK refuses to act. Madam Deputy Speaker, history will judge this government and this Parliament for its sin.
Order. Andy McDonald.
Deputy Speaker, I am honoured to serve as the co-chair of the Britain-Palestine APPG. We face a stark legal reality. The UK's duty to prevent genocide is triggered the moment a serious risk becomes evident. The International Court of Justice made that clear in January 2024. Judge Joan Donoghue stated the court found a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. The court issued provisional measures directing Israel to prevent genocide, measures Israel has ignored. Words matter too. Israeli President Herzog declared, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible." Under international law, such statements are evidence of intent. The UN Commission of Inquiry confirmed that the ICJ's provisional measures placed all states parties on notice of a serious risk of genocide in Gaza, triggering legal obligations on third states, including the UK. As its chair, Navi Pillay, stated, Israel has flagrantly disregarded the orders for provisional measures from the International Court of Justice and continued to the strategy of destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza. Yet in September 24, UK government lawyers concluded there was no serious risk of genocide occurring. That defies the court, the Commission and the law. The UK itself has argued that genocide is not limited to killings. It includes forced displacement, serious bodily or mental harm, and deprivation of food, particularly when children are targeted. Despite this, the UK has failed to acknowledge the risk, failed to respond to the ICJ or the Commission, and failed to act as it has elsewhere. So can I ask the Minister, what evidence would be required to accept the risk of genocide if neither the ICJ nor the UN Commission of Inquiry suffices? And why, when the UK has argued that acts against children and forced displacement are indicators of genocidal intent, it has not applied that standard here? Madam Deputy Speaker, history will judge whether we acted when the warning signs were crystal clear. I urge the government to acknowledge the risk and meet its legal duty to prevent genocide.
House.
Madam Speaker, all of us, I know, are here in this chamber because of the horror we have for the events of October the 7th, but the atrocities that took place have taken place thereafter and continue to take place. But many of us are also here because of a profound sense of shame. Shame at the way the last government and the way this government has conducted itself throughout this entire affair. And amongst the many shames that we will all have to bear, one of them is its reluctance to vigorously and assertively participate in the international rules-based order which we built to prevent exactly this kind of eventuality. As other members have said, I don't understand what the government thinks the ICJ was doing when it ruled there was a plausible case of genocide. Did he not think that they were triggering exactly the obligations that other members have mentioned already? And those obligations are not rhetorical. They are operational, they are real, they are obligatory.
We have to act to prevent. We cannot facilitate. And yet, time and time again, the British government in this regard has done absolutely nothing. From arms to intelligence sharing to diplomatic cover, we've continued as normal. And I'm left wondering, myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, what it is this country stands for anymore. Because it's not just on this obligation. On the Torture Convention, where the reputable human rights organisation, Israeli reputable human rights organisation, B'Tselem, have just published a report saying that Israel is running a network of torture camps. Nothing from the British government, notwithstanding its international obligations. On the settlements in the West Bank, 100 parliamentarians wrote, the ICJ has ruled, and yet the government has done the bare minimum it can get away with to enforce those obligations. And then even the individual cases that we've seen coming across our telephones and social media. Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, tortured to death. Hind Rajab, the world heard her as she lay dying in a car, left alone at the age of 6. Ambulances ambushed, hospitals flattened, schools crushed. Even when British citizens are slaughtered, and we have an obligation, surely, to them, if we don't feel we have an obligation to anybody else, the government has done nothing. This is a monstrous abdication of duty, Madam Deputy Speaker. In this regard, the law is not unclear. The facts are not hidden. Daily, we hear Israeli ministers boasting about what is being done in Gaza. But what is missing, I'm afraid, is political will. And it's about time that the Minister and his superiors realised that history doesn't just judge what governments do, it judges what they allow.
Order. Dr. Rupa.
The UK recognition of Palestine reality, a Gaza ceasefire under Labour, but still 70,000 Palestinians killed, now a figure accepted by Israel, 500 since the ceasefire, repeated forcible displacement, whole neighbourhoods gone. Is this genocide? Like Srebrenica and Rwanda. The ICJ will take years to determine, but the UN Commission of Inquiry and International Association of Genocide Scholars say yes. How does Joe Public decide? With NGOs, 37 of them, including Oxfam, effectively banned and international media excluded, external mechanisms that should help us assess are gone. So targeted measures are rendering it impossible to judge. The civilian/combatant line is blurred, given the women and children deaths, making the IDF claim that they always minimise casualties questionable. The very risk of genocide raises Britain's obligations under the 1948 Convention to prevent or risk complicity. And whilst we have allowed children to travel to the UK from Gaza for medical care and students in, we've also seen hospitals in Gaza and schools, churches, mosques, universities, refugee camps destroyed. This biblical devastation is man-made.
Well, Honourable Friend, give way.
Yes, I will.
Thank Honourable Friend for giving way. We're here to discuss genocide, but in Gaza, as she says, 20,000 children have been killed, 95% of hospitals destroyed, and food blocked to the point of famine. Does my Honourable Friend agree with me that this House of Commons, indeed the world, cannot sit by and let this happen?
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I know that he worked for Save the Children before, which has also been deregistered. I mean, the shame of it. We must act. And a systematic discrediting of the UN. UNRWA buildings destroyed. Francesca Albanese accused of being a witch and sanctioned by the US. And what's proposed in place of the UN? The Gaza Board of Peace, headed by Donald Trump, $1 billion to join. Zero Palestinian representation, yet Putin has a seat, as does the presidential son-in-law and Netanyahu. With a founding charter that doesn't mention Gaza, the UK must not give this vanity project any credence. Hear, hear. Extremist Israeli ministers have been sanctioned and 30 arms licences suspended, but as the facts worsen on the ground, we must ramp up. We must support real peace efforts, as opposed to the grubby real estate deals devoid of international law that bypass Palestinians. And in Qatar, even the ceasefire negotiators were bombed. Of course, Hamas's acts of October the 7th must be condemned, but Netanyahu's war cabinet since have way gone beyond self-defence. Starvation and the erasure of the international presence to gather evidence of what might or might not be a genocide must raise alarm bells and require urgent action to be on the right side of history. So no to the Board of Peace, a toughened sanctions package and arms embargo, a full ban on trade in settlement goods, and not just the present situation where it's tariff reductions.
Susan Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The recent events we've seen unfold in Gaza have been without doubt horrific. Some of the worst atrocities that have taken place in modern times, carried out by Israel and centred in one small region. We've seen the targeting of civilian infrastructure, causing the maximum level of suffering on the civilian population. We've seen the imprisonment of medical professionals. As recently as last month, the UN Office for Coordination of Human Affairs reported that 1,700 aid and health workers have been killed. And now, in a period of ceasefire, the Israeli government continues to severely restrict the entry of nutritious food, medical supplies and materials to repair and rebuild civilian infrastructure, and over 400 Palestinians have been killed. Palestinians continue to face famine, their homes are flattened, their friends and family are killed, and the forced displacement. We've also seen upwards of 250 journalists killed, entire news crews wiped out by airstrikes and targeted shootings. The people sent to the front lines to document and report struck down beside those they tried to help. I urge the government to take proactive steps to ensure the release of Palestinian medical professionals held in Israeli prisons, who should be free to care for the injured and sick, and the safety of journalists reporting in Gaza. Without people to document the events unfolding in conflict zones, we are left without the evidence required for reconciliation. Civilians are left without their first safeguard of international law, and aggressors feel a sense of immunity. The Liberal Democrats are clear that the Israeli government has committed a genocide in Gaza, and that those responsible need to be held to account. Looking forward, we have a responsibility to protect those in the occupied Palestinian territories. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government has been too slow to react to events in Palestine and the West Bank. They must step forward and step up to their duty in international law and acknowledge the risk of genocide.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Questions of genocide are amongst the gravest that Parliament must consider, and I'd like to thank so many of my constituents who've written to me in advance of this debate. In the case of Gaza, the International Criminal Court of Justice has ruled that there is a real and imminent risk of genocide, and this was given 2 years ago. The court is still deliberating the case, and a final judgment is expected next year. But in the meantime, this risk requires action. In my short time allowed, I would like to focus on one of those actions. There is a strong case for the government to ban trade with illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank. No further legal judgment is needed to do this. While global attention has focused rightly on Gaza, on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, settlement expansion, land confiscation and violence have continued. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed there, and economic activity linked to settlements risks undermining the UK's long-standing position on their illegality and on the viability of a future current Palestinian state. The Minister has been clear that settlements are illegal, and I thank him for meeting with me to talk about this previously. The mechanism exists to do this. The UK-Israel trade agreement already differentiates settlement goods, denying them preferential tariffs. So there are postcodes which show exactly where goods come from already. The government should now consider moving from differentiation to prohibition, using legal tools already available under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, as we have done in relation to Crimea. There's precedent, there's law, there's the ability to do it technically. Palestinian civilians, Palestinian children have endured extraordinary suffering, displacement, hunger, trauma and loss. They are entitled not only to charity, but to the protection guaranteed under international law. A ceasefire alone is not enough. The absence of bombs is not the presence of justice. Without reconstruction, accountability, justice and a viable political and economic path, the suffering will continue. So I would be grateful if the Minister could outline whether the UK will now support the collection and preservation of evidence of war crimes that will be needed for the justice system to work, and when the government will move ahead on legislation that's needed, it's only regulations or perhaps some secondary legislation, to stop the trade with these illegal settlements on the West Bank, in line with the UK's stated policy and international legal obligations.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I first of all draw members' attention to the declaration in the members' interests? The question was asked at the very start of this debate: whose side are we on? Now let me make something very clear. I'm on the side of the people who suffered one of the most horrendous terrorist attacks on the 7th of October when their citizens were raped, burnt, taken into captivity, killed in cold blood, and their killers actually boasted about it and stuck it on the internet. And secondly, I'm on the side of those people who since then have suffered the most sectarian abuse because they were Jews and happened to live in this country. And with the question being asked, well, how can we ignore the fact that the International Court of Justice has made a ruling? First of all, it has not said there was any intent. And secondly, the judge who made and who decided in that case was actually twice a candidate for Prime Minister of Lebanon, with the support of a terrorist group. So I don't think that we can see the International Court of Justice as being a body which is independent here. Secondly, the facts are that Israel took every attempt to reduce the civilian casualties in Gaza. Well, one of you has to look at the ratio of civilian casualties in Gaza to what happened in Iran, what happened in Afghanistan, and the actions which were taken, even putting their own soldiers at risk by leafleting, telephoning, using UN coordination to say when they were going to strike and withdrawing some of their strikes when they did. Who put the civilians in harm's way? Hamas made it quite clear that civilians being killed would put blood into the veins of resistance. That's the kind of enemy they're up against. And I don't think we're going to find that, even if there were an investigation, that Israel was reckless in the way in which it responded to a terrorist attack on its own civilians. I'll give way, yes.
There is never any justification to kill the number of civilians that have been killed. This is a genocide, and it's not just the ICJ that said it. What about the UN Special Rapporteurs, the UN Independent Experts, the UN Commission of Inquiry, Amnesty International? What about the Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, the International Association for Genocide Scholars, and over 600 senior lawyers in the UK, including Lady Hale and Lord Sumption, and many others who call it a genocide?
Well, Hamas would actually disagree with the member, because Hamas actually boasted that the killing of civilians would help to increase the resistance and put some fire into the resistance. So before accusations are made against Israel, let's look at the record of Hamas in putting civilians in harm's way, basing their rockets and their firing points on hospitals, schools, civilian infrastructure, and therefore inviting the retaliation and inviting the fact that the Israeli armed forces had to take action in doing that. The rules of engagement were such that even the former Supreme Chief of NATO was able to observe that when it came to the way in which Israel engaged the enemy in Gaza, their standards were higher than what we would have expected even of the British Army in such circumstances. My concern is this: that this motion and this demand I'll not give way. This demand will be used to justify the intimidatory marches which we see week after week through through the United Kingdom. It will be used to justify the barricading of Jewish businesses, the banning of Jewish students and academics from universities, and will also be used to justify even the banning of Israeli sports fans from the, sporting events in the United Kingdom. This is part of the campaign to justify the sectarianism which is now creeping into the debate in the United Kingdom.
Order. Steve Witherden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the honourable member for laying out so powerfully the extent to which our government has failed in its responsibilities to assess the serious risk of genocide and our legal obligation to act under the Genocide Convention. Since the latest US-brokered so-called ceasefire took effect, Israeli forces have killed more than 500 Palestinians. The genocide is far from over. I know comrades from across this House will rightly speak on accountability today, so I will focus on our complicity. I'm extremely concerned by the government's apparent move towards unblocking the already insufficient 29 out of 350 arms licences to Israel that were suspended in September 2024. It was the government's own assessment that there was a serious risk of British-made weapons being used in violation of international law. Yet on the 12th of January 2026, in an interview with the Jewish Chronicle, the Secretary of State committed to revisiting both UK-Israel trade discussions and the decision to pause arms export licences, adding that the two matters were intrinsically linked. Such a claim is entirely at odds with the government's legal obligations under the UK's own strategic export licensing criteria and international law, including the Genocide Convention. In addition to the continuous supply of spare parts enabled by the F-35 carve-out, last month 3 new F-35s were transferred from the UK RAF station at Mildenhall to Israel. Palestinians continue to be failed by our government. The government mustn't renege on its arms export control criteria now Gaza is away from the front pages. If the government were to weaken its commitment to international law in order to secure a trade deal, that would be frankly shameful. I said in June during my adjournment debate, this government's approach to export licensing was deeply troubling. 7 months after questioning the minister's claim about so-called third country re-exports, I am still awaiting a response. This week I have written again to the government about the changes to arms licences and the F-35 transfers. I sincerely hope a reply will come more promptly. The testimony of Mark Smith, former diplomat and policy advisor at the FCDO, sheds light on the disturbing level of access and influence the arms industry holds over government decision-making. This influence buys government complicity and makes a mockery of international law to safeguard profits. As he put it, the system is not designed to hold itself accountable, it is designed to protect itself at all costs. I once again call on the government to suspend all arms exports to Israel.
Order. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very grateful to the member who got this debate today and all those that have spoken in it, because we're doing this on the background of 71,000 people that are known to be dead in Gaza as a result of Israeli bombardment. And on top of that, there are many thousands of bodies lying under the rubble that will no doubt become the foundations of the casinos and hotels that the Trump plan is visiting upon the people of Gaza. I had the privilege of attending the South African application under the Genocide Convention at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It was a deeply moving experience, hearing the South African application, the bravery with which they put it, and thinking, this is the country that threw off the yoke of apartheid and had the courage then to stand up for the Palestinian people facing genocide as they are. And the conclusion by the eminent judges was there was a credible case that genocide had been committed. They're going through many, many details on it. Following that, I introduced a 10-minute rule bill in this chamber last year. And that 10-minute rule bill called for this country to set up its own tribunal of investigation on its own participation in arms sales to Israel and the bombardment of Gaza. Unsurprisingly, it was blocked, and so what I did was then, through the Peace and Justice Project, established our own independent Gaza tribunal. We held it over 2 days in Church House, Westminster, and I was joined by Hal Hanouri and Nev Gordon, who assessed a great deal of detailed evidence. Obviously, in the 1 minute 15 seconds left to me, I can't go through that evidence. But what I would say is quite simply this. The power of the evidence of doctors in tears because they didn't have the equipment to deal with the horrendous injuries that they were asked to deal with in hospitals without electricity, anaesthetic, antiseptic, or even clean water. And the legal evidence that was given and the evidence given by former FCO official Mark Smith were very, very powerful indeed. And the supply of RAF, supply through RAF Akrotiri of weapons to Israel. So this has now been taken up by the Hague Convention of a group of UN member states who are going to carry on with that. And I conclude in the last half minute I've got with this. As was pointed out earlier, this country was involved in supporting and indeed establishing in the 1920s the International Court of Justice. We pride ourselves in being the custodians of international law and order. This country is making itself complicit in the genocide of the people of Palestine by its supply of weapons. It's time to stop.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member opposite for bringing forward this vital debate, because to many of us it has always been abundantly clear that what is taking place in Palestine does indeed constitute a genocide. Since the Israeli attacks began in 2003, over 70,000 have been killed, entire bloodlines wiped out. We have witnessed targeted attacks on civilians and journalists, the forced displacement of people from their homes, the obstruction of humanitarian aid, the weaponisation of starvation, and the destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools and universities. Taken together, these actions demonstrate a clear and deliberate attempt by the Israeli government to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their land. Since the ceasefire was announced in October, hundreds more Palestinians have been killed. Aid continues to be blocked from entering the region, and there are severe restrictions on the number of sick and wounded people permitted to leave for medical care. Let me be clear. Even if Israel had fully complied with the ceasefire agreement, and even if they were to cease all attacks today and allow the unconditional flow of aid into Gaza, none of this would undo the suffering already inflicted on the Palestinian people, nor negate the fact that what has taken place constitutes a genocide. It is vital that we use the correct language. History will not describe what is unfolding in Palestine as a war or an invasion or just an occupation. It will describe it as a genocide. The questions future historians will ask are why the international community failed to recognise it and why we did nothing to stop it. There is a growing body of evidence and a clear consensus among UN experts, human rights organisations and genocide scholars that Israel has committed and continues to commit acts of genocide. The UK has a legal obligation not to aid or assist violations of international law, including a duty to take all possible measures to prevent genocide once a risk has been identified. Yet we continue to sell arms to Israel, which are undoubtedly being used to attack civilians. I therefore hope that when the Minister responds, he will explain why the government believes it's acceptable to continue arms sales and trade that aids Israel's actions, including with illegal settlements. It is our moral duty as a nation with historical responsibility in the region and as advocates for human rights to ensure that the Palestinian people are granted the justice, freedom and dignity they deserve.
Seamus Logan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, the member for Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber, for bringing this important debate to the Chamber today. And I want to highlight this is only the second time a backbench debate in Gaza has taken place in this place. The reaction of the UK government since they came to office has been at best supine or at worst grossly negligent. They have responded to the UN International Independent Commission of Inquiry reports on other contexts, for example Ukraine, and rightly so, but they have failed to do so for Gaza. Back in September 2025, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory found that Israel had committed a genocide against Palestinians in Gaza.
Thank you to my friend for giving way. On October the 2nd, As part of the UK delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, I voted in favour of a resolution regarding the devastating humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. And paragraph 8 of that referred to the UN Human Rights Council finding that the Honourable Member has referred. Paragraph 8 highlighted the obligation of all state parties to prevent genocide under Article 1 of the UN Convention. Would the Honourable Member, like me, welcome comment from the Minister today about the UK's response to that Assembly resolution?
I thank the member for her intervention, and I completely agree with her. Within recent days, we learned that the IDF has admitted its role in the death of at least 70,000 Palestinians. Meanwhile, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warns us that as we enter 2026, the clock is ticking louder than ever, with conditions on the ground in Palestine remaining perilously fragile. Only yesterday, the UN Committee mandated to promote the realisation of Palestinian rights, reaffirming calls for a two-state solution. Secretary-General Guterres endorsed this as the only viable path towards achieving long-lasting peace and security between Palestine and Israel. But in this context, at least another 449 men, women and children have been killed by Israeli forces during this so-called ceasefire. Why can the UK government not see what the UN can see? Why do they accept the UN's reports in Ukraine, but not Gaza? Why did they not accept the conclusions of UK-based lawyers, including Supreme Court justices, who signed a letter to the Prime Minister confirming that a genocide is being perpetrated in May last year? Now, I wish to turn to the letter that I and 57 other parliamentarians have signed, led by the MP for Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr, explaining to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade that we were extremely concerned for the government's apparent move towards unblocking the arms licences to Israel that it suspended in September 2024 and the transfer of new F-35s from a British airbase. This is at odds with the government's international legal obligations, including the Genocide Convention. I hope the Minister will be able to explain this decision, given the ongoing violation of the ceasefire by Israeli forces in Gaza, continuing the genocidal horror of these past 2.5 years. When talk of peace involves the perpetrators of violence and not the violated, not the voices of those who have lost so much on all sides, war crimes will go unpunished and festering wounds of injustice will lead to further conflict. The Prime Minister, as a former human rights lawyer, must understand this. Why then, given everything we know, given all we have witnessed, does his government remain in a state of ambivalence on assessments of genocide under international law in Palestine? Does the clue to this answer lie in this government's protection of trade and diplomatic ties to Israel and the US?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What the Palestinian people have endured is cruel, inhumane and completely unacceptable. We know that last year it was an Israeli government blockade that led to the United Nations and others to declare a famine in Gaza. We know that the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu for war crimes, and we know that more than 90% of the homes across Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The UN's report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory concluded that Israel has committed genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip under the 1948 Genocide Convention, and human rights organisations such as International Association of Genocide Scholars, as has already been mentioned, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and Oxfam have already expressed the view that genocide has been committed by Israel under international law. Israel has also recently revoked licences of 37 international NGOs. Madam Deputy Speaker, the
on that point?
Yes, of course.
I know from working with the Norwegian Refugee Council, including Amelia Rule, my constituent, who's the head of shelter and settlements for the charity, the vital work they're doing. But as you say, in January, along with 37 other NGOs and aid organisations, they were banned from operating in Gaza. The move is plainly an attempt by the Israeli government to circumvent international institutions and accountability. So does he agree with me that the government and international community should attempt to use its influence and all its leverage to push for this ban to be rescinded so that aid organisations like the Norwegian Refugee Council can continue their life-saving work?
Yes. I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. It seems to be quite clear that the reason why these licences have been revoked is to prevent aid from going through, and therefore it leads to at least the assumption that there might be the risk of genocide taking place. The UN Genocide Convention requires states to prevent and punish genocide, and I would like to repeat the definition of genocide under Article 2 of the Convention. And it defines genocide as any act committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part, and I emphasise the words in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. We cannot stand by and pretend that it is for an international court to decide whether or not genocide has occurred in the occupied Palestinian territories, and we cannot turn a blind eye as innocent Palestinian people continue to suffer. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are fortunate in this House to have enough distinguished lawyers to decide whether there is at least a risk of genocide having occurred, and to conduct that risk assessment as the debate has requested. When do we decide that enough is enough? When do we decide that enough innocent people have been killed and that enough suffering has occurred for us to consider that an ally of ours, Israel, may be committing genocide under international law, and for us to take decisive, concrete action to prevent that genocide by the Israeli government?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for securing the debate today. I secured a debate in Westminster Hall in June last year on the same topic, and the arguments that I set out at length there still hold, and indeed have been deepened and strengthened by events since then. The Green Party has long been clear that the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza do constitute genocide. But I agree with my honourable friend from the opposite side that it is important to be clear about language. So I will make very specific arguments with respect to the Genocide Convention today. The UK has a legal obligation to assess the risk of genocide and act to prevent it when that risk is clear. Under the Convention, Article 1 specifies contracting parties undertake to prevent and punish genocide. Prevention, by definition, has to happen before an event has happened or before it is completed. It can't wait for a court case after genocide has conclusively concluded. Does the Minister, therefore, accept that the UK has a duty under the Genocide Convention, Article 1, to prevent genocide when a serious risk is identified? Article 2 sets out a range of acts that, if committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a specific group, constitute genocide. There are 5 acts specified. Only one of them needs to be occurring in order for it to be concluded that this is genocide. And there is very widespread agreement that at least 4 of these are happening. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. What else is the cutting off of water, the prevention of delivery of food, of life-saving medicines, of fuel and power, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The destruction, the wholesale destruction of healthcare in Gaza is clear evidence of this. It's not just me who says this. It's not just the International Court of Justice that says it. The International Association of Genocide Scholars, MSF, Amnesty, B'Tselem, Oxfam Human Rights Watch, the UN Commission of Inquiry, hundreds of British lawyers, as we have heard. So can I ask the Minister, why does he not accept the conclusion of this wide swathe of people that genocide is indeed taking place, or at least that there is a plausible risk, which therefore entails his obligations under Article 1. Article 3, Part E, specifies that complicity in genocide is punishable under the Genocide Convention. Now, let us be clear about UK complicity. Export of arms, including F-35s, sharing of intelligence, continued participation in settlement trade, which is participation in the proceeds of crime, land seizure. What more evidence does the UK government need that we are complicit in it, that genocide is taking place before it takes the actions that are in its power and are long, long overdue?
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member from Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber for bringing this debate, firstly, and for so clearly and accurately setting the scene. The awkward truth for many in this Parliament is that genocide has occurred in occupied Palestine for decades, and the silence from the international community has allowed and enabled Israeli governments to persecute and oppress the Palestinian people, and has emboldened Netanyahu and his murderous regime to commit the genocide that we have all witnessed in Gaza. But Israel commits different types of genocide. Last November, I was fortunate enough to be in the West Bank, and I heard of the cultural genocide that is taking place. Students and lecturers unable to go to university because of roadblocks and checkpoints. I heard about the universities, colleges and schools that have been flattened throughout Gaza. Lecturers now giving classes in tents as makeshift classrooms. How on earth do we expect Gaza to be rebuilt when Palestinians are unable to be educated? Netanyahu's government has also, by design, crippled the Palestinian economy by impacting their ability to trade, making Palestinians reliant on Israel for goods, produce and ultimately their very survival. Israel uses economic terrorism as a tool of subjugation. With the seizures of Palestinian farms and by making it almost impossible for those that remain to trade, then Israel impoverishes Palestinians. And this is a concerted international effort to normalise Palestinians' reliance on Israel to be the providers of life-saving aid, while making it near impossible for Palestinians to be self-sufficient, driving Palestinians to starvation. As well as this collective punishment of Palestinians, another goal of this broader plan is to impose capitalism through the imperial project the Israeli government promote, and all willfully aided by Western democracies. Shame on any government of any party of any nation that has allowed and been complicit in these awful atrocities.
If interventions are made, not all colleagues will get in. Please consider that. Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for securing this crucial debate. And as he said, any person of conscience can and must condemn both the illegal actions of Hamas on October the 7th and the illegal actions of Israel in its response for the 850 days since that horrific day. Yet, despite the plausible risk of genocide inflicted by Israel upon the Palestinian people having been identified by the ICJ, the UN and multiple other agencies and experts, successive UK governments have consistently refused to acknowledge this risk, and they have failed in their obligations to take immediate proactive measures to prevent a genocide of the Palestinian people. However, whether the UK government calls Israel's actions a genocide or not will not bring back Hind Rajab, her 6 family members or the 2 paramedics that tried to save her. Whether the UK government calls Israel's actions a genocide or not, it will not bring back the 2,700 family bloodlines wiped out at Israel's hands, or the relatives of over 6,000 sole survivors. Whether the UK government calls Israel's actions a genocide or not, it will not bring back the parents of a new generation of Palestinian orphans created through Israeli slaughter, like the 3-year-old Wissam, who was left with a lacerated liver and kidney after an Israeli airstrike that killed her 5-year-old brother, her pregnant mother, her father and grandparents. Whether the UK government calls Israel's actions a genocide or not, it will not bring back the almost 300 journalists assassinated for trying to report Israeli war crimes in real time. Whether the UK government calls Israel actions a genocide or not will not bring back the over 100 Palestinian hostages executed in Israeli detention centres in the last 2.5 years. I regret I do not have time to pay tribute to each and every individual murdered by the genocidal Israeli regime who will not be affected by these government's decisions. The point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that accepting the irrefutable and serious risk of genocide would oblige the UK to hold Israel accountable. It would save lives in the present by creating legal obligations for the UK government to seize arms exports and impose sanctions and prosecute those committing war crimes. I end my speech with a quote from Francesca Albanese. The ongoing genocide in Gaza is a collective crime sustained by the complicity of influential third states that have enabled long-standing systemic violations of international law by Israel. She goes on to say, framed by colonial narratives that dehumanize the Palestinians, this live-streamed atrocity has been facilitated through third states' direct support, material aid, diplomatic protection, and in some cases, active participation. The UK has aided and abetted this genocide.
Order, John McDonald.
The reason we're here is because there is a profound responsibility on us as members of Parliament in particular to ensure that our government acts according to the law, according to the international humanitarian law. And there are two questions that we need to pose time and time again. Is first of all, what evidence would it take to convince the government that there is a risk of genocide, not a genocide, a risk of genocide? And secondly, what is the process that the government should use to determine that? On the first question of evidence, I am absolutely perplexed why the evidence that we've used, the methods that we've used in the past where we've determined there is a genocide, aren't simply being accepted by the government at the moment. The loss of life, the 70,000 has been said. The way in which the genocide has been perpetrated, the particular attacks on the health, the doctors, 1,700 we know about. We know of at least 100 that have been imprisoned, tortured, denied access to medical facilities, even to their own families as well. The number of... No, I can't accept any, I'm afraid. The number of journalists, because part of that genocide is to prevent the reporting of the genocide, over 300. And yes, the forced movement of people, 9,000 prisoners in Israeli prisons. 100 died in this last 2 years. That's the evidence we present time and time again. It's the same evidence we've used in the past to determine genocide. Why is it not acceptable now in this particular instance? The second is the process. Let me just say to the Minister, time and time again we've had these debates. People have lost confidence in the process the government is using to arrive at its determination of whether there's a risk of genocide or not. And the internal processes, I'm afraid, not just to members of this House, but also to the wider public, not have they lost confidence, that's what's forcing people out onto the streets and informs of direct action as well, because they've lost confidence in the government's own objective assessment. So therefore, let me suggest to the Minister, why not establish an independent commission? Use people like Philip Sands and others. Let the House determine who sits on that so that they can report back to the Minister on the evidence that's available, because I think once they see that evidence, the government will have to accept at least there is a risk of genocide, and as a result of that, it will have to determine the action, some of which have been set out today, about the end of trade, the end of the arms sales, the prevention role that we have to play in securing peace and justice for the Palestinian people, and yes, the Israeli people, for the long term.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the beginning of this latest catastrophe after the horrors of October the 7th, many of us who have been asking for balance, respect, and nothing more radical than a justice-based international order have been castigated, and some of us have been even criminalised. We are now 26 months into this horror, and we're still asking for the same thing. We are pleading for principles that we as a country, after 2 wars and after humanity confronted its own capacity for evil and promised that never again, we built structures to ensure this will never happen again. And yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, Gaza has stripped away any remaining illusion that this rule-based order still exists. Let us be clear what we are discussing here today. Genocide, as defined in international law, is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a people because of who they are. Measured against this definition, the government's position on Gaza is not cautious, it is morally incoherent. At least 71,000 Palestinian men, women and children have been murdered. We have witnessed this in real time, and yet we are told to wait. We are told not to jump to conclusions. So where were the systems that were meant to guide us when humanity crossed that line once more? Let's start with the media, the purveyors of the truth. Well, foreign media are not allowed into Israel, so what has happened? 300 Palestinian journalists have been killed. One of them was Anas al-Sharif, and let us quote what he said before he was murdered. God may bear witness against those. No, he said, I never once hesitated to convey the truth exactly as it is, because God may bear witness against those who have stayed silent in this world. And silent, Madam Deputy Speaker, is precisely what too many of them have done. What then of the international rule-based order? The International Court of Justice is hearing a genocide case. Advisory opinions have been issued. The law is trying to work. Yet when the International Criminal Court seeks accountability, when it does what it has done before, the response is not support, but hostility. Sanctions are imposed. Threats are made. In fact, a Foreign Secretary allegedly threatens the ICC Chief Prosecutor. The accountability would mean like dropping a hydrogen bomb. So I ask this plainly. Are international courts only legitimate for the accused when they're Africans? Journalists have been killed, courts are intimidated, and international law is subverted to feed a genocide. Perhaps then aid workers, 1,500 have been killed. Surgeons crying in front of children that they're trying to save in this country in a few days are dying right in front of them. This is just daily life in Gaza, and we have no political will, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I will end on this. This weekend, I watched The Voice of Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old who became the voice of the children of Gaza, trapped in a car with her family. She cried out that night to the world, "It's getting dark. Please come and save me." Nobody came for her. It's getting dark for the world. We must lighten the world up for them, Madam.
Florence Ashinami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this important debate. Like many members, I've received many emails from constituents across Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, and I speak today to give a voice to their concerns. It's difficult to put into context the sheer scale of death and destruction we have seen reported in Gaza over the last 2 years. We all know the figures. One in every 33 people have died since the start of the assault. Over 90% of homes have been damaged. And behind these statistics, as the member for Leicester South just highlighted, these are real human stories. We've heard from doctors in Gaza who are operating without anaesthetic, emergency C-sections performed on women without painkillers, and a rapid increase in child mortality. We heard of children who've been shot not once but twice by snipers. And it's easy for us to sometimes become desensitised to what we are seeing, but we must not stop calling out what we are seeing. The world-respected peace charity, Doctors Without Borders, that have been banned from operating in Gaza and the occupied West Bank after they refused to hand over their list. And what does this mean if life-saving organisations that carry out war zones are being banned? The UK must be very clear on this. As a signatory to the Genocide Convention, we have a legal obligation to call out and prevent genocide, as do the other 153 states that ratify that treaty. And for that treaty to be effective, for us to stop not just this but future genocides, it must speak with one voice. And we must listen when the United Nations tells us, and I quote, that Israeli authorities and Israeli security forces committed 4 of the 5 genocidal acts defined by the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide, namely killing, causing deadly bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring the end and destruction of the Palestine in a whole or part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births.
On that point, I thank my honourable friend, the Select Committee Chair, for giving way in this important debate because, as she points out, 1 in every 33 people in Gaza has been killed and 1 in every 14 has been injured. Does my honourable friend agree that this sheer colossal scale of assault on the Palestinian people demonstrates the mass and indiscriminate action and indicates a clear risk of international law violation and genocide?
I thank my honourable friend for making that important intervention, and I think this is what we are all trying to get. Members from right across the House want answers on this. And Madam Deputy Speaker, listening and acting to such respected voices with one voice is imperative. It is vital for our ability to stop future genocides. Genocide is not something we can only recognise when it's politically convenient. It is something we must call out whenever and wherever it's occurring, without fear or favour. What we are seeing in Gaza in plain sight, it meets the definition of genocide. I urge the Minister to listen to the powerful voices from across the House in the way he's been listening for many occasions, in the way where he meets with us and listening to our concerns from our constituents. Because if we don't, there will be a reckoning in terms of what's happening before our eyes, and history will judge us for anything less.
George, on 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll be very quick. I do congratulate the honourable member for
for Argyll, Bute and Lochaber for bringing this issue. I was worried that we would be concentrating primarily on the jurisprudence of the merits of whether the definition reached the threshold, and we're politicians, and I certainly don't have the skill set to make the analysis. And what I found is that we get arguments advanced, like the Honourable Member for Bury St Edmunds, very elegantly made, of course, but engaging in the political sophistry around the issue itself, and that does worry me, because I think that the bottom line is that what has been happening in the Middle East has been appalling, and the level of death and destruction has been shocking to the world. I mean, of course, the horrors of the 7th of October 2023 were absolutely appalling, but the response, the overwhelming opportunity for retribution, the way that the Netanyahu regime has taken such advantage in order to be able to do that, I think is something which we all need to reflect on. But it's not just the mass murder within Gaza itself. It's also the fact, as some people have said, that our aid workers, including Cornish aid worker in Jim Henderson, it wasn't careful, as the Honourable Member for South Antrim has said. It has not been careful strikes. It's been indiscriminate and certainly a clear murder. I just hope that the government will stop doing the minimum that it can get away with. It'll stop the trading. It'll stop the excusing. It'll stop the supporting of the Israeli regime. It's in the interests of international world order. It's in the interest of Palestinians and Palestine, and it's the interest of Israel itself to get this sorted.
Thank you so much. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Dr L. Pinkerton with just a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What we have witnessed in Gaza is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. It has been a catastrophe both for the hostages who have endured Hamas's brutal captivity and for the millions of Palestinian civilians whose lives, homes and communities have been devastated by Israel's military offensive. So let me be absolutely and unequivocally clear in the Liberal Democrat position. Alongside global NGOs, aid organisations, Israeli human rights organisations and the UN Commission of Inquiry, we consider that there is credible evidence that the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza during its military campaign have amounted to genocide. Hamas, meanwhile, for avoidance of any doubt, is a terrorist organisation whose crimes on the 7th of October were acts of mass human atrocity, and which we continue to utterly and categorically condemn. But given that reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, what matters now is accountability on all sides. And that is why access to Gaza for journalists and human rights organisations is so fundamentally important. I'm reminded that in Bosnia, British journalist Ed Volemi exposed the existence and brutality of Serb-run detention camps. His reporting later contributed to the proceedings of the International Criminal Tribunal, forming part of the evidentiary record for prosecutions that included findings of genocide. It's imperative, therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we do not allow evidence in Gaza to disappear, damage to be cleared away, or truth to be lost before accountability can be pursued. But accountability in itself is not enough. This must sharpen our focus on what's required to move beyond repeated cycles of violence. Only genuine progress towards a two-state solution can deliver lasting security and dignity for Palestinians and Israelis. So, the Liberal Democrats call on the government to rule out ever participating in Trump's Board of Peace. Reconstruction must be coordinated by the United Nations with the involvement of the Palestinians who have been excluded from Trump's proposals. Aid must be allowed in at scale and rapidly. Hamas must be disarmed. There's no place for a genocidal terror group to take part in Palestine's future. The UK should ban all trade with illegal Israeli settlements. And finally, the UK must deepen its engagement with the Palestinian Authority following the recognition of the State of Palestine. International law underpins our shared liberal values and indeed our British values. It exists to constrain power, uphold accountability and protect civilians across the world. I urge the government to act now.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I begin by thanking the Honourable Member for Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber and the Backbench Business Committee for securing this debate today. Before turning to the legal issues, though, it's important to begin with the fundamental moral reality of this conflict. And I want to be clear.
We welcome the release of the surviving hostages who returned home to Israel after more than 730 days in captivity. They were abducted by Hamas, a proscribed terrorist organisation, and held in conditions that are utterly unimaginable. We pray for the health and recovery of those who survived and for their families as they attempt to rebuild their lives after such trauma. But with the return of the final hostage, our thoughts are also with the families of all those who will not be returning alive. This conflict arose from the brutal massacre of civilians on the 7th of October 2023, the worst terrorist attack in Israel's history and the worst pogrom against the Jewish people since the Second World War. If the current ceasefire is to lead to a long-term and sustainable peace, then one principle must be non-negotiable. Hamas must no longer hold power and its terrorist infrastructure must be dismantled. Recent reports of violence between Hamas and other armed groups within Gaza underline precisely why Hamas cannot be part of Gaza's future. Hamas governs through terror and repression. It prioritises its own survival over the welfare of Palestinian civilians, and the suffering in Gaza is directly linked to Hamas's choices and its governance. Now, much of today's debate has focused on allegations of genocide, so let us be clear. We do not believe that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocide. That was the position of the last Conservative government, and to my understanding it remains the position of the current government, and I hope the Minister will reaffirm that clearly in his response. Every innocent life lost is a tragedy, but the Israel Defence Forces do not deliberately target civilians. Hamas, in contrast, embeds itself in civilian areas, stores weapons in schools and hospitals, and uses civilians as human shields. Israel's stated objective is to dismantle an Iranian-backed terrorist organisation that threatens its very existence. Hamas's objective is the destruction of the State of Israel, the world's only Jewish state. It's long been the British position that determinations of genocide are matters for competent courts, not unilateral political declarations. This is fundamental, and I'd like to ask the Minister to confirm this remains the government's position, and if he also accepts that genocidal intent is not abstract in this conflict. The Hamas Charter and the language routinely used by Iran and its terrorist proxies openly calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. Should we not be unequivocal in calling out those terrorist and genuinely genocidal ideologies rather than misapplying that most serious of legal terms? It is precisely because genocide is the gravest of crimes that the term must be used with care, with discipline and legal precision. The Genocide Convention was never intended to be reduced to a political slogan or applied without rigorous assessment of intent, evidence and context. To dilute that standard is not to protect international law, but to undermine it. Yeah. There is much more, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to talk about today, not least the humanitarian situation at the moment. But I will conclude, conscious of time, by saying that the Abraham Accords remain a credible pathway to regional peace. Saudi normalisation with Israel is central to that effort. The Conservative Party is clear about the future we seek. We are committed to a future in which terrorism has no place and Hamas is permanently removed from power. And we are focused on what comes next: a safe and secure state of Israel and a Gaza rebuilt, governed responsibly, free from terror and capable of offering its people stability, dignity and hope.
Mr Hamish Faulkner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber for opening this debate, for his contribution as the Chair of the APPG, and I thank every member who has spoken with such clarity and conviction. These are incredibly important questions at a moment where questions of international justice are very much discussed. So I hope honourable members will forgive me if I really do insist on accuracy in some of these questions. Let me be clear, to answer the question straightforwardly, as I did at length on the 15th of September in front of the Business and Trade Select Committee, the British government has conducted an assessment on the risk of genocide in accordance with our international legal obligations. As I said, I think yesterday or the day before from this dispatch box, we consider our international legal obligations of the utmost priority. I am confident many honourable members have asked me to attend to my conscience over the course of this last 90 minutes. I am confident both I, the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and the Government as a whole are serious about our international legal obligations and serious about the process and rigour that underpins them. I have confidence in that judgment, both given the extensive scrutiny it has received from the House, but because these questions have also been tested by our own courts, most recently by the Court of Appeal in November and indeed in September beforehand, where they considered the process of assessment explicitly. I will give way.
Minister, the problem that we have, or the question, is about accountability and transparency. Our domestic courts do not have the footing in order to test whether the government has truly got it right. So it falls on this House, for us as members of Parliament, to assess and to help see whether you've got it right. But the problem we've got is we don't have the details. We don't have the methodology, who's assessing, what time and what date it was done. Will the Minister commit to at least disclosing that information?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I answered something like 105 questions related to these issues in front of the Select Committee in September. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to describe it in the House in greater detail, but given the shortness of time, I might just turn also to a few other questions of accuracy. Firstly, the ICJ has not made a finding of genocide yet. They have made provisional orders. I agree with the Honourable Member for East Antrim about the scourge of anti-Semitism. I do not agree with the question he raises about the independence and impartiality of the Independent Court of Justice, International Court of Justice. It is a vital international institution. We need to see it do its work. We undermine it if we seek to jump to the end of that process. It will be for the court to make a judgment. It, of course, is for the government to consider our obligations and indeed make an assessment of risks, which we have already done. I will give way.
Given what the Minister said about adherence to international law, would he just put on the record why the government hasn't responded to the advisory opinion of the ICJ for over 18 months now? Is it because the consequence of that response would be there would have to be sanctions against settlements which are illegal under international law?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend who has paid close attention to these matters both over the last 18 months and before. I want to just I will answer his question, but given the pressures of time, let me be clear also, for the sake of accuracy, it is simply not credible to suggest that the policy of this government is the same as the policy of the last government in relation to these issues. That, I'm sure, was obvious from some of the remarks of the Conservative Foreign Affairs spokesperson. But to be clear, I have stood at this dispatch box to recognise a Palestinian state, to announce sanctions 3 times, including against Israeli ministers. Does that mean that the obligations on this government to do everything that we can to address the horrors of Gaza is discharged? No, it does not. But we do the House no service if we pretend that the policy that I have been responsible for as the Middle East Minister was the same as that of the benches opposite. My honourable friend asked a good question about the advisory opinion. Over the course of the last 18 months, the British government has clearly made a very fundamental change in its view of the legal position in relation to Israel and Palestine. We now recognise Palestine. It is in a context in which Britain has changed its policy very significantly indeed that we want to ensure that we respond to what is a far-reaching advisory opinion with the rigour and the seriousness it deserves. I know that I am straining his patience and the patience of the House with that answer. I am sure I will return soon, but I wouldn't want to give the House or the public the impression that we have not taken significant steps in the course of that 18 months. I would also like to very briefly touch on the most recent events in Gaza. These legal questions are incredibly important. They've been considered both by the courts and the relevant select committees. I just want to bring to the attention of the House some of the recent developments in Gaza.
Would the Minister give way?
I will.
I thank the Minister. On recent developments, my grandfather fought for our country in Palestine. There are reports that the IDF has destroyed a cemetery in Gaza containing graves of Allied troops from both World Wars. Would the Minister condemn this?
I would. From my own constituency, there are two privates, William Jordan and Wilfred Ogden, both in that cemetery, both who have now had their graves defaced.
Question is, as on the order paper, as many that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'll give a point of order, Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Early on in the debate, I referred to several organisations and individuals, and due to time constraints, I was unable to do so with full accuracy. In the interest of clarity and to keep the record of this House correct, I now seek to set the record straight. I referred to the International Court of Justice. I clarified that it has found a plausible risk of genocide, triggering the clearest legal duty on all states to prevent it. I then referred to UN Special Rapporteurs, UN independent experts and the UN Commission of Inquiry. They have all warned of genocidal acts and catastrophic intent. Madam Deputy Speaker, I refer to the 600 lawyers...
Order, order. We cannot continue the debate. No doubt that the record is now clarified. We cannot continue having the conversation. This debate is now over. It's 5:01. So I let the front benches for a moment